For over 2,000 years, mathematicians, philosophers, and scientists looked at this structure and asked the same question. How does an insect with a brain smaller than a sesame seed consistently produce geometry so perfect that it took human mathematicians until 1999 to formally prove it was the optimal solution? The answer, when it finally came, turned out to be even more surprising than the question. Look closely at a honeycomb. Really look at it. Hundreds of identical, perfectly formed wax hexagons, locked together in continuous geometric repetition without a single gap, without a single misaligned wall, without a single cell that deviates from the pattern. The precision is absolute. The consistency across thousands of individual cells, each one built by a different bee at a different moment, is essentially perfect. Human architects working with rulers, set squares, and centuries of accumulated mathematical knowledge struggle to achieve this level of consistency at scale. A colony of bees achieves it as a matter of routine, in darkness, inside a crowded wooden box, using nothing but their own bodies as tools. This has bothered thoughtful people for an extraordinarily long time. The ancient Greeks noticed the perfection of honeycombs and wrote about it. The mathematician Pappus of Alexandria, writing in the 4th century, proposed that bees must possess some form of geometric knowledge, that nature had somehow equipped them with an understanding of shape and efficiency that exceeded what most humans could consciously articulate. For 2,000 years after Pappus wrote those words, the question remained formally open. Everyone could see that the hexagonal structure was optimal. Nobody could prove it mathematically. And nobody could adequately explain how an insect was producing it. Both of those gaps closed within 14 years of each other, in findings that genuinely surprised the scientific community. But before we get to those revelations, we need to understand where the honeycomb begins, not with geometry, but with chemistry. If you want to build a honeycomb, you need wax. But bees do not find wax in the environment the way they find nectar or pollen. They manufacture it internally, through a biological process that is expensive enough to make every gram of wax a genuine investment of colony resources. Inside a healthy hive, young worker bees between approximately 12 and 18 days old serve as the colony's primary wax producers. The process begins with food. A bee that is going to produce wax must first consume significant quantities of honey. Researchers have calculated that a colony must consume approximately 8 pounds of honey to produce a single pound of usable beeswax. The metabolic cost is substantial, which is precisely why bees are so efficient with the wax once they have produced it. On the underside of the worker bee's abdomen are 8 specialized organs called wax glands. After the bee has consumed and metabolized sufficient honey, these glands begin secreting tiny, transparent flakes of beeswax, each flake roughly the size of a grain of salt, from pores on the abdominal surface. The bee uses her hind legs to scrape these flakes from her abdomen and pass them forward to her mandibles. Fresh beeswax in this raw state is brittle and unworkable. The bee chews it carefully in her mandibles, mixing it with saliva and warming it with the heat of her body. This combination of mechanical manipulation, chemical treatment from the saliva, and thermal softening from body heat transforms the brittle raw flake into a soft, plastic, workable material with properties remarkably similar to modeling clay, pliable enough to be shaped, stiff enough to hold that shape once cooled. Thousands of worker bees contribute wax simultaneously to a growing comb, passing material between them, adding it to the structure in small increments, each bee working on her own section while the larger pattern emerges from their collective effort. No individual bee has a blueprint. No single bee can see the whole structure she is contributing to. And yet the structure that emerges from their combined effort is one of the most geometrically efficient constructions in nature. The question that haunted mathematicians for 2 millennia is deceptively simple. Of all the possible shapes a bee could use to build storage cells, why hexagons? Start with circles. A circle is in many ways the most natural shape. It is what you get when you draw a boundary around a central point at constant radius, and it encloses the maximum area for a given perimeter. But circles have a critical failure when packed together. They leave gaps. Where 3 circles meet, there is an empty triangular space between them. In a honeycomb context, those gaps represent wasted space that would need to be filled with extra wax, adding material cost without adding storage capacity. Squares and equilateral triangles both solve the gap problem. They tile a flat surface completely without any wasted space between them. But they introduce a different inefficiency. For a given area of enclosed space, both squares and triangles require more total wall length than hexagons do. More wall length means more wax. More wax means more honey consumed to produce it. More honey consumed to produce wax means less honey available for the colony to eat and survive on. In a biological system where energy efficiency is directly tied to survival, this is not a minor consideration. The hexagon occupies a unique mathematical position. Among all the regular geometric shapes that tile a flat surface without gaps, the hexagon requires the least total wall length per unit of enclosed area. It packs space completely and does so with maximum material efficiency simultaneously. In 1999, the American mathematician Thomas Hales published a formal proof of what had been known as the Honeycomb conjecture, the proposition that a hexagonal grid is the most efficient way to divide a flat surface into equal areas with minimum total perimeter. The proof ran to hundreds of pages and required computer assistance to verify all its components. It confirmed, with mathematical certainty, what bees had been demonstrating empirically for tens of millions of years. Charles Darwin, who had examined honeycombs extensively in the context of his work on natural selection, called the honeycomb a structure absolutely perfect in economizing labor and wax. Darwin understood intuitively what Hales later proved formally, that natural selection, operating over sufficient time, is entirely capable of arriving at mathematically optimal solutions through the accumulation of small efficiency advantages across generations. Here is where the story takes a turn that most people find genuinely difficult to believe the first time they hear it. Bees do not build hexagons. In 2013, a research team led by biologist Bhushan Buzate at the University of Exeter published findings from a careful study of honeycombs at various stages of construction. By examining combs that were actively being built rather than finished examples, they were able to observe something that had never been clearly documented before. At the growing edges of an active honeycomb, the cells are not hexagonal. They are roughly circular, cylindrical tubes of wax, each bee building what amounts to a round container centered on her own body, using herself as the template for the cell's diameter. The cells at the active construction frontier look nothing like the perfect geometric honeycomb that characterizes a finished comb. So how do circular cells become hexagonal ones? The answer is physics, not biology. It is the same physics that governs soap bubbles, foam, and any system where thin films of material under surface tension meet at shared boundaries. Inside an active beehive, worker bees constantly vibrate their flight muscles to generate heat, a behavior called thermogenesis, maintaining the interior of the hive at approximately 35 to 40 degrees Celsius during normal operation and somewhat higher in the area of active comb construction. At these elevated temperatures, freshly deposited beeswax softens significantly. It does not melt into a liquid, but it becomes pliable enough to flow slowly under mechanical stress. As the circular wax cells press against each other in the growing comb, they exert mutual pressure at their shared walls. The softened wax at these contact points flows and redistributes under the influence of surface tension, the same physical force that causes soap bubbles to adopt their characteristic shapes and causes the walls between adjacent bubbles to meet at specific angles. Surface tension drives thin wax walls toward the configuration that minimizes their total surface energy. Four cells of equal size pressing against each other with equal force, that minimum energy configuration is flat shared walls meeting at 120-degree angles. 120-degree angles between three walls meeting at a point is the defining geometric property of the hexagonal grid. The bees build rough circular tubes. The physics of heat, pressure, and surface tension transforms those tubes into perfect hexagons as the wax cools and sets in its new configuration. The 2013 finding reframed the entire question that had occupied mathematicians and naturalists for 2 millennia. The question was never really how bees understand geometry. The correct question, turns out to be how evolution shaped bee behavior to cooperate with physical law in producing an optimal outcome. Natural selection did not need to give bees geometric knowledge. It needed only to give them a set of behaviors: produce wax internally, chew it to the right consistency, build circular cells of the right diameter, maintain the right hive temperature, that, when combined with the pre-existing laws of physics, reliably produce hexagonal geometry as an emergent consequence. This is a profoundly different kind of solution than anyone had imagined when the question was first posed. It is not intelligence producing geometry. It is biology setting up the conditions for physics to produce geometry automatically. The bees are not the architects of the hexagon. They are the contractors who prepare the site and supply the materials. Physics is the architect. And physics has been delivering the same perfect design, without variation or error, for as long as bees have been building honeycombs, which fossil evidence suggests is at least 34 million years. 34 million years of perfect hexagons. Not because bees are geometrically gifted. Because surface tension does not make mistakes.